My chance new girl watch made in China. We play ping pong ball.
Hello and welcome to China Econ Talk. I'm your host Jordan Schneider here today with Lorand Laskai, a researcher at a prominent centrist American think tank. We also have joining us a guest host, Athena Cao, a researcher and analyst based here in Beijing. So thanks to you two for coming on the podcast. Looking forward to this today. So our topic today are two totally interrelated streams. The first on Trump trade and made in China 2025, and the second on Chinese tech CEOs being forced to make apologies based on content issues. So before we jump into those things, Lorand, I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit about your China story and what got you interested in these sorts of issues.
Yeah, so I went to China first in 2011. I was a junior in college and somehow found myself doing summer research in Beijing without any China experience, and was completely overwhelmed and completely unprepared. But I got a taste and I decided to come back. So after I graduated college, I spent a year studying Chinese in Taiwan, which is a terrific place to study Chinese if anyone is interested in doing that. And then I went over to the mainland. I did some fun odd jobs, ran a debate league, and ended up at the Financial Times doing research on China tech and tech policy and sort of finance-y related stuff. So yeah, it's been a wild ride, and and last year I called it quits and came back to the States.
So can you tell us a little bit about the Chinese debate scene?
Yeah, it's strangely, it's a very it's quite large. It's definitely flourishing. It's one of those things you don't think would succeed in China, but among a certain group of students, many of which want to study abroad, like debate actually turns out to be one of their favorite activities. So I think you have to check in with the debate leagues to see how many people there are. But I mean, when I was doing it, we had like something like 30 or 40 tournaments a year with 200 to 300 students. So it was quite large. In comparison, Model United Nations did not take off. So there's an interesting data point.
So something I heard is that just the idea in the Chinese education system of kind of having to articulate your own arguments and push back and forth isn't necessarily something that is all that seen, and that ends up being an aspect of the kind of debate environment, which is obviously central, and then really attracts a certain type of kid. Did you see that as this being a kind of outlet and really standing out relative to the rest of the educational system?
Yeah, I mean, I think all the common prognoses of the Chinese education system are completely right. It's very test based. It's not particularly into developing creative, thinking or critical thinking or anything like that. But I mean, there is, China is a large place, and there's a lot of students that crave that, or they don't know they crave that, and then they try something like debate, and they find out that they quite like it. And a lot of those students might be like coming from liberal coastal cities where they have more of a Western style upbringing, but you'll go to cities like Lanzhou or Hefei, and you'll find students that are they're incredibly combative, and they love debating, and they make arguments that the party would very much approve, but they find that they really like it. So there's a lot of debaters out there. I mean, I think you definitely see like the urban rural divide. Like you go to smaller cities and you will get a far more conservative bunch of students that will make, pretty, I mean, by our standards, wacky arguments about, like for instance, I remember once a student basically setting up so every time when you do debate, you have to set up a standard of evidence. Like what is your threshold for something being correct or for you to win? And you'll usually say like I win this tournament if I prove that like most people will benefit from my policy, and I there were students who'd be like I win this debate if I put down arguments that most align with the words of Chairman Mao, So you'll get a lot of stuff like that. But I mean, I think there's definitely like ideological divide, and it's sort of the reverse of what you expect in the United States.
Right, right. I remember in high school there's this course called, if you translated literally, it would mean thinking and consciousness. And basically to ace that course, all you have to do is to repeat what the party says. So yeah, on
Yeah.
conservatism. Right. So going a little closer to what we're really trying to talk about today, how was covering the Chinese tech scene being for you while you were at the Financial Times, and what were some of the biggest stories back then?
So I mean, so full disclosure, I was a researcher at a part of the Financial Times that is not the news bureau. So I was at Danwei, which was previously an independent research firm that was bought by the Financial Times, I think I want to say in 2012. And so we sort of did long-term, in-depth projects on various parts, things that clients would be interested in. So I think one of the major things that was different for me than a typical journalist is that I could go in and say I was a business researcher and usually didn't receive the same pushback as a journalist would receive. But I think at the time, like the big story, or the story that we were covering quite a bit, was the first few years of the CAC, the Cyber Administration of China. I mean, everyone was sort of wondering what this entity is going to do, and their sort of charismatic, sort of trollish leader, Lu Wei, was making waves. So yeah, I mean, I think there was at the time, it's the same as today. There was just a big question mark over what the government was going to do related to tech, and a lot of companies were quite worried. And to add to that, I mean, this was also around the time that the Chinese market had that summer stock market crash. So and the government was sort of arresting various financial moguls, or they were being disappeared, and there was a lot of fear and paranoia over how the government was going to interact with private business.
So when it comes to fear and paranoia, the recent apologia by the CEO of Bytedance was certainly had some of those aspects to them. Do you want to give us a bit of context as to what happened over the past 2 weeks? Maybe introduce what Bytedance is.
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting moment in Chinese tech. So Bytedance is perhaps one of the most interesting new companies on the Chinese tech scene, and they're basically their biggest app is Junru Toutiao, or Daily Headline, the direct translation is. And they're basically a large news service. They provide what is the equivalent of the RSS feed for their users, with a very strong machine learning backend that sort of caters what news and items you see to people's interest. And their numbers are just astounding. They have something like 700 million users. Like over 100 million of those are daily users, and I think the average time they spend is something like 70 minutes a day. Like these are numbers that like Facebook would love, or most social media companies would love. And so Bytedance has been really good at making apps like that, that are incredibly interactive, have a social media element to them, and then are powered by these strong algorithms that really track what people want and give them what they want. And I think my suspicion is that one of the reasons, like a lot of Chinese tech firms, one of the reasons that they're so successful is they're filling a niche that needs to be filled. And the simple fact is media in China is not super interesting. I would love to get your opinion on this too. But there's a lot of sort of communist jargon and state media dribble that's not particularly appealing to the average reader. And what Junru Toutiao will do is it'll give you all the sort of most sensationalist, the interesting stuff it can find for you. And if you click on it, it'll give you more and more of that. So I think as a result, what we've seen is that the Chinese government has been a little uncomfortable with how the company has basically created a user base that is plugged into its media ecosystem. So I mean, fast forward to the last year, we were seeing regulators continuously coming after Zhuru Toutiao for the usual charges, sort of disseminating vulgar and erotic content, which is very much against the law. And we've seen repeated apologies from Bytedance employees saying, we're going to do better. We're hiring more censors to make sure that none of the content that is getting to users is illegal. And then and I think it was in January, and feel free to correct me if you know the actual date. In January, the Cyber Administration of China just took down a few of Zhuru Toutiao's services for 7 or 8 days. And this is very much like a warning, like we're serious. We want you guys to change. So yeah, I mean, there's been this brewing conflict between regulators and Bytedance. And I mean, Bytedance is this huge company that's raised a ton of money, and it's really like so many other Chinese tech companies come virtually out of nowhere. And they have large plans both domestically and abroad. They want to expand. I think they have a great product. But as often the case when it comes to social media and the media ecosystem in China, the officials are not really willing to cede authority on what people read. So that brings us to this recent apology.
Right. If I may just add some details to the context, the background of this apology. Bytedance, along with several other, I guess you could call news sites, or in general apps or information sites, have received these what Lorand called temporary bans from the App Store, basically, as you mentioned, as a warning to remind these companies that you have to first and foremost be under the party guidelines when you're publishing these contents. But this time it's very severe, and I believe that triggered the written apology. This time it's different because one arm of the Bytedance company, it's literally called Inside Jokes. The app itself is called, I'm not sure if this is the most official translation, but the literal translation would be like an inside dark joke, kind of an app where people put up these, you may say, vulgar jokes they come up with themselves and video content. This app got shut down permanently, and from unofficial sources, this app is supposed to generate like 2 to 3 billion RMB for the company this year. That's like their internal goal. So this time it really hurt.
Can you actually tell us more about internal jokes? Because I think this is one of the apps that I did not unfortunately get to partake in, because I didn't realize they existed when I was in China. Is it appropriate to say it's sort of like 4chan, but maybe like a little more mild?
I've never used it, but it's got this stereotype that so I think what the party really doesn't want to see happen is large flocks of people gathering on the internet on one app or another to talk about a certain level of content. By that I really mean like these people talk about jokes that, say, educated first tier or second tier city people wouldn't want to talk about on the table. These are jokes that you would expect. These are jokes that are politically very incorrect. And you don't really want to talk about these jokes with your parents kind of content.
To me, it sounds sort of like what you would see, I mean, as a Western sort of comparison, sort of see what you would see on Reddit. There's sort of like an internal lingo, and people like to, there's a lot of running jokes that sort of evolve over time, and people feel like initiated.
You can think of it as the blue pill.
Yeah, exactly.
What's interesting is that there were actually rumors around ByteDance buying Reddit, 6 or 10 months ago. So, God knows what would have happened to that God knows what would have happened to Reddit had that deal gone through. There's another thing we'd be remiss in talking and not talking about ByteDance is the giant new hit that this app has had with Douyin, which has absolutely blown up over the past 3 or 4 months. It's sort of like a Musical.ly plus Vine, and it's very clear that content does not have this sort of dark edge to it. It's a lot of more first and second tier cities, folks kind of making very lighthearted jokes, and seems to be more of the type of thing that would not necessarily get ByteDance in trouble moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think one sort of broader theme here that's worth fleshing out is that, the Chinese government is incredibly pro-tech. They have insane sort of goals about becoming a cyber superpower, and they very much prioritize their tech sectors, and they've turned them very much into like a sort of national treasure. Like you can see in state media things about like the 4 great inventions of China and stuff like that. But at the same time, the Chinese government doesn't actually quite like tech that is sort of very social media driven. It's sort of exists online. It generates value through user interaction. It doesn't quite like this stuff. It's sort of similar. It's probably quite similar to why authorities don't really like Facebook or see any value in letting it into the country. These things aren't like washers or dryers or robots or other industrial equipment that actually generate value. And at the end of the day, like the government is really interested in those types of things. They want things that are A, not political, and B, to generate something of value. And I think as they see the way that social media has shaped the world, first by promoting democracy and giving activists a platform, and then later by giving trolls and Russian trolls and stuff like that a way of sowing dissent. They've really sort of looked at the social media companies with a lot of suspicion. I think we're seeing that with ByteDance, which is in some ways should be one of the companies that the Communist Party is very proud of, because it's a huge company is going to have huge international presence. But instead, we're seeing the exact opposite, which is the Chinese government coming down quite hard on one of its biggest companies.
Right, exactly. So it's really important to understand that ByteDance is not a media or even a social media company. ByteDance has made it clear since day one that it wants to be a big data company. And I think the executive Zhang Yiming mentions this in the letter as well, that this is really a tech company. And ByteDance really operates the same as the Google model. It really earns ad money. And it's been super successful because it's the company, the company that knows the best about its users. As soon as a user comes into any of the ByteDance products, the company tracks what phone you're using, what courier you have, how much time you spend on a certain article, and they pitch you these articles for you to read or videos. And they actually record whether they've hit the target, whether they got you right, whether they got you wrong. If you didn't read it, what are the potential reasons they could think of? So this is really a company that analyze user behaviors and try to make ad money out of that. Instead of a company that, like Facebook, wants the world to be a more connected space.
I mean, I will say that I think ByteDance and Facebook's model are not all that different, because they are both sort of generating ad content, and they're engaging users to basically sell them content. But I mean, I think like I would go actually a step further than you and say that ByteDance is not just a big data company; it's an AI company, and I think a lot of the success they've had is with deep learning algorithms that are so good at just like sucking up your data and telling you exactly what you want. And I mean, they made headlines sometime last fall for offering this insane package for AI scientists, like something like $3 million just starting out. And, there's a ton of like small perks too that went along with that huge paycheck. And that's more than any other company in the world has been offering for just for AI scientists. But I mean, I think the critical thing here is like Facebook or a lot of other companies in this space, the government doesn't really see how what this company is doing is of benefit to them. I think it's easy for them to see Huawei and see that Huawei is working on next gen technology. It's putting down fiber optic cables. It's doing all these things. Like these things are aligned with the party's goals. With ByteDance, it doesn't really see that. I think employees at ByteDance have been trying to sell the government on its technology. Last fall there was ByteDance executives met with officials from the Cyber Administration of China and other regulatory bodies and basically tried to sell them on their anti-rumor filter, which is basically using machine learning as a way of capturing or catching rumors and erasing them from the web. And evidently they were not impressed enough.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to see how this sort of government interference in these types of tech companies impacts their international expansion plans, because these sorts of moves would I imagine make American and European regulators much more wary if the Chinese government does have so much power over a content provider. I mean, if you're worried about fake news from Russia on Facebook and Twitter, imagine what type of concern you would have if it's a Chinese owned app, and there's some issue around the Taiwan question or North Korea, things that the Chinese government really is spending a lot of time and money trying to message, like the idea that they wouldn't also rely on their Beijing-based technology companies to push that seems pretty clear to me, and something that I imagine foreign, particularly Western governments are going to be definitely on the lookout for.
Yeah, no, I think Jordan is completely right. I think one of the underreported stories, and one of the ones that I would love to know more about, is ByteDance's international expansion, because they've been incredibly active in markets like Latin America and have been buying up small outlets and trying to create a media ecosystem for these countries. And that's something that other companies in China really haven't succeeded in when it comes to content providing. I know Baidu had tried to sort of puncture the Latin American markets and failed pretty miserably. So it'll be interesting to see how they do abroad, because they do have large international ambitions.
Right. I think any content platform, at the end of the day, their competition mode would be the content that's already on the platform. So for any foreign company to really penetrate a new market, I think that would be really hard, because you don't have content that's tailored to that market's appetite. Instead, I think ByteDance might want to do something like outsourcing its AI abilities, because I think ByteDance is the first company in China to really start its own AI lab, and just the data points that it accumulated over the years is astonishing. And for them to maybe help or teach a different content platform abroad to analyze these data, I think that would just be huge, and certainly something to be wary of if it's sensitive content.
Yeah, and I think as a point of comparison, like looking at ByteDance, which is, again, as we've said, is like an AI company with other Chinese AI companies like SenseTime or Face++, which are, they rather than the business of content providing, they're in the business of scanning people's faces and identifying them, or using object-based AI to improve surveillance, or to be able to create facial IDs for as a form of for payment or other things. These companies have been incredibly successful, and you've seen the government being relatively hands-off with their operations and in fact giving them support through various means. I believe it was Face Plus Plus just raised a ton of money, and it was and a large backer is some state-backed fund. So we're seeing very different responses from the Chinese government depending on what exactly the AI company is doing with their technology.
And with that, we're making an awkward transition to trade. So, I think before jumping into the current back and forths that are going on between Trump and Xi, it's important to give a bit of context to to what's been going on in Trump's mind, because he's the real prime mover when it comes to the recent tariff battles and the potentially incoming trade war. Do you want to give before we jump into the presidency, or maybe we should start with the primary in the general election. So what Lorand was going on with regards to Trump's rhetoric in that time period?
Yeah, so I can try to fill in the timeline, and please chime in if I miss anything, just because there's been so much going on. It's almost hard. It's hard to get to. I feel like all this has been years ago at this point, just based on the sheer number of events. But yeah, I mean, you go back to the primary, and China was one of the issues where Trump, quote unquote, told it like it is. He said something to the extent, that China's raping the American economy, and that things like the WTO and these free trade agreements were a big mistake, and that China has basically been stealing our technology, our jobs, what have you. So I mean, I think and this seems to be for Trump, if we're going to do some character analysis here, it seems to be for Trump, this has been long standing. He really looks at trade in this sort of winners and losers, zero-sum type way. And going back to the 80s when, Japan was on the rise, we've seen Trump basically say that, we're letting the Japanese, take advantage of us. So this seems to be like one of his deeply held convictions that our trade and economic cooperation with China is a mistake. So, I mean, you fast forward to where we are today, and I think a number of things have happened which are not just connected to Trump. I think it's also the people that Trump has hired in the sort of China-Asia department in the National Security Council or Council in his in the U.S. Trade Representative Office. They've picked up a lot of people with strong held beliefs about how we need to change the relationship towards China. Robert Lighthizer, the U.S. Trade Representative, has long felt that we are letting China take advantage of us, that Chinese treatment of U.S. companies is completely unfair, and that the U.S. government should do more to balance the relationship. And in addition, this has been overwhelmingly a topic which I think China experts have said we need to do something about. If you look back to last January, when Asia Society in New York put out this high-level report on the U.S.-China relationship, where they included basically every major China expert, from Susan Shirk to Elizabeth Economy to Orville Schell, and they basically were listing out what they thought the priorities should be for the next president. Creating reciprocity in the economic and trade relations with China was high on the list. It was, the general feeling was that we've sort of let China do its own thing without opening up its market to our companies, and that the Chinese, as they've become more wealthy and have started investing abroad, that there's very much been this asymmetrical relationship forming where the Chinese can invest in all possible sectors in the United States, and U.S. companies are really restrained and constrained to what they could do in China.
So there was really this narrative in the U.S. which was running from even post Tiananmen, basically the idea being that if we help China open up economically and allow them to engage with the global market, eventually this development will spill over into better behavior on the world stage and slow but sure democratization, which clearly in the era of the endless reign of Xi Jinping is not the case. So I think there was a reckoning, not necessarily. I mean, it's important to understand that this reckoning, as Lorand was describing, these folks, Susan Shirk, Elizabeth Economy, and others, are not right wing fire breathers. These are kind of like the middle of the road, center left type folks who would have been in or would have certainly been advising a Hillary Clinton administration. So the idea that it was high time for the U.S. to figure out how to put more pressure on China from an economic openness standpoint is not necessarily an out of the mainstream run, but the method in which Trump has been doing that over the past few weeks certainly is not the way that many other presidents would have gone about it. So if you want to bring us up to speed, Lorand, over what has transpired over the past month or so with these very quickly escalating tariff threats.
Yeah, so I mean, I think you set up the scene very nicely that there is a growing concern that we need to do something, and now Trump, as the man of the hour, has formulated his plan. He's basically has taken the first steps to putting the United States on a collision course with China over trade, and it didn't really get off to the right start, or at least the way that most experts would have liked this to have gone down, which is Trump's steel tariffs. And basically, before starting this prolonged trade contestation with China, Trump just went ahead and issued a indiscriminate tariff on foreign steel, and that didn't just impact China, or probably impact China. It's going to impact China relatively less than our allies like Canada, Germany, other EU countries. So that was immediately sort of muddying the waters, so to speak. And so what Trump did is he signed this tariff, and immediately there was uproar from allies and from neighbors. And then over the following weeks, he signed a bunch of waivers, basically like giving the EU and Canada, and I can't remember if Japan also got a waiver, but basically giving these countries some assurance that they're not going to get targeted. But at the same time, the Trump basically started this trade war by hitting all of the countries that are not China, and then proceeded to hit China. And that was what happened a few weeks ago when Trump came out and announced $50 billion in tariffs against Chinese high-tech goods. Now, I think there's an important distinction here, because I think everyone was, generally right to say that the steel tariffs were a bad idea. Steel is not an important industry. U.S. is a steel consuming nation. We don't have the production capacity to meet domestic demand. Basically, the people that will be absorbing the cost of the tariffs are not foreign countries, but U.S. workers and companies. So, it was overall a bad idea. Whereas the $50 billion trade tariffs were, if you look at the details, they were quite carefully thought out. And I think that's probably, we owe that to Robert Lighthizer and the U.S. trade representative to the United States. So in U.S., so I don't have to say that out. U.S. trade representative to the U.S. is USTR. So if we could just say USTR, that'd be great. So fast forward to where we are right now, and basically Trump announced these $50 billion in tariffs. The USTR came out with a list of high-tech sectors which they were targeting. And when you think about the sheer scale of U.S.-China trade, $50 billion is not a lot, but it was targeting strategic industries that China wanted to develop and was subsidizing heavily to develop. And interestingly, whereas we didn't really see much of a response with the steel tariffs, the Chinese really almost immediately responded. They responded with in kind with tariffs of their own. And in some ways they seemed to be ready for a fight. They were gonna hold the hill, so to speak. They didn't they weren't going to give in or let this sort of this action go unresponded to. And what Trump did the next day is he upped the ante and he announced $100 billion in tariffs. Now, this announcement didn't come with a particular detailed list of which sectors will be targeted, but in some ways it was a pretty bold move, because the U.S. ultimately buys a lot more from China than China buys a lot from the U.S. If China wanted to slap on another $100 billion in tariffs, they would run out of exports to target, because the U.S. just doesn't export that much to China. So that's sort of where we are right at the moment. And I think these tariffs don't go into effect for another month or two. And, in the meantime, there's going to be a lot of jockeying and a lot of signaling. And there's going to be, the goal is hopefully to come to some type of resolution so we don't have an actual trade war. But, with Trump, and anything is possible.
So as someone who drinks whiskey and eats almonds here in Beijing, two of which are potentially facing 25% tariffs, I am particularly rooting for Xi and Trump to find some sort of solution. So one of the big sticking points which Robert Lighthizer focused on in his 200-page report, which was kind of the broader indictment of Chinese industrial policy over the past number of years, was this Xi-driven policy Made in China 2025. So could you talk a little bit about Made in China 2025 and what about it so incenses Washington policymakers?
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting part of this unfolding drama, and one that personally I did not expect. One of the things I was lucky enough to focus on when I was at the FT was Made in China 2025, which just was, I think it was issued less than a year ago at that point. No one was paying attention to it. It was barely registered in the United States that there was this plan. And but when you looked at the specifics of the plan, it was very clear this was going to be very significant, that the Chinese government was interested in making this leap to sort of high-tech sectors, basically industries that have high value added, that are, basically at the moment dominated by countries like the United States, like South Korea, like Japan, like Germany, things like automation, robotics, semiconductors, aviation, aerospace, all these industries which generate a lot of value, and they sort of are very difficult sectors to get into. And because, of China's economic transition as it tries to move away from low value added sectors and labor intensive sectors, like textiles and sort of the things that we all associate with Chinese made goods, which are, sort of cheap products, things that are made on the cheap and sort of have a lot of labor input. As the Chinese government tries to transition away from that, it makes sense that they would want to break into some of these high-tech sectors. What is surprising, or what I think ultimately put off a lot of DC policymakers in Germany and other advanced industrial countries, was basically the scale and the mission of it, because it wasn't simply that we want to incubate these industries so we can compete internationally in things like, sort of new energy vehicles or something like that. It wasn't that they wanted to basically be part of the competition. The plan very much laid out a plan to eliminate the competition and to basically take over these sectors. And this is, I think, a really important point and the reason why policymakers in DC are so upset about it, is because it was basically a plan for China not to play fairly by the rules. It is a plan to subsidize high-tech industries, to basically do something that's called technology substitution, where the plan will basically incentivize companies to buy domestically made products or components. So as a sort of a background to this, most high-tech products incorporate a lot of components that are made everywhere in the world. And one of the major components of the global economy at the moment is this sort of high-tech supply chain that spans multiple countries. Like, you will have in any sort of sort of advanced computing equipment, for instance, you will have components made everywhere, from semiconductors in Korea to, microchips made in Japan. And basically all these things are created in different places and usually can put into the same product, or put into one product, one finished product. And basically what China said it wanted to do is they wanted to subsume this whole high-tech supply chain. They wanted everything to be made in China, which, scared a lot of people, and it justifiably so, because a lot of advanced industrial economies, especially like South Korea and Germany, really rely on these sectors and being able to sort of contribute to this high-tech global supply chain, which is the foundation of a lot of economic growth. So, and that's really what, and this is, I think, one of the reasons why we need to take Trump's trade action seriously, or at least acknowledge that there's serious people behind it. Because when you looked at the USTR report, it wasn't the sort of Navarro rhetoric about China, raping the U.S., or China sort of taking American jobs and not playing fairly. It was a very sort of authoritative, specific, substantive report on basically what Made in China was 2025 was doing, and it was connecting that to U.S. companies and U.S. job security. So I mean, that's where we are today. We have basically this confrontation over a Chinese policy. I think it makes sense. It makes sense that we're here.
So one of the interesting things is that it seems like this is going to be a real turning point for Made in China 2025, in that given the recent action around ZTE and semiconductors, where almost all of this is due to some unrelated sanctions incident, but probably not all that unrelated, since it's coming out at the same time as this big trade issue, is that this kind of autarkic vision of technology creation may be coming a little faster than Beijing might have hoped. So on the one hand, this may accelerate the process, but it also might mean that these technologies companies are going to have to eat the bitterness for a little while they try to reconstitute these supply chains and build more at home. I imagine that the government is going to be sympathetic to these difficulties that the companies are going to face if and when this trade war gets going. But it imagines that 2025 might be accelerated a little bit, not necessarily due to MOFCOM's plans or anything, but just as the West kind of forces stops trusting China on these issues of industrial and technological policy, and forces them even more into their own world of production.
Yeah. I mean, I actually think I think the ZTE case is actually worth going into just a little bit because it's really fascinating. So it's completely unrelated, or at least originally was unrelated to Made in China 2025, and it was basically ZTE, one of these large telecommunication equipment companies, sort of like Huawei, was getting into trouble with the U.S. government because they were exporting goods to North Korea and Iran. And why is that a problem? Well, because the United States is sanctioning both those countries, and the products that ZTE is making uses a lot of U.S. components. It uses U.S. microprocessors. It has a number of suppliers in the U.S. which basically allow them to make their products. And this is a really common theme we see in Chinese tech, which is, despite this talk of self-sufficiency, or basically, subsuming all of the high-tech developments, Chinese companies are incredibly reliant on a lot of U.S. technology. And what ultimately happened, and we can skip some of the drama to what the recent decision was, that the Department of Commerce slapped a ban on ZTE from buying anything from any technology product from a U.S. company. So that covers everything from the processors that go into ZTE products to things like the Google Play Store. And suddenly ZTE is basically the U.S. government just eviscerated ZTE. The company could very well go bankrupt unless some type of settlement is reached. Now, there are potentials for ZTE to replace a lot of its components with Chinese-made components. And, I think it will be interesting to see if they can adapt and whether the Chinese government will help them adapt. But at the same time, I think it's really, especially if you look at Chinese media, it's really, I think that if, it's easy to say a lot of these things going on right now are to sort of crossing the Rubicon point, so to speak, like the point of no return. But, the ZTE case is really a crossing the Rubicon, so to speak. The Chinese feel very much vulnerable to because of their reliance on foreign technology. And yeah, we're going to have to see where this goes. There's probably going to be renewed talk of sort of developing indigenous technology in China when it comes to semiconductors and things like that. And as sort of a bit of background, in 2014, the Chinese government approved a major plan to basically jumpstart development of China's semiconductor industry, and they invested a lot of money into it. And I guess almost 4 years later, we aren't seeing huge strides forward. So it's been very much a tough challenge for China. So we might see them double down on it to pour more money into it. So it's going to be interesting to see how things play out.
Yeah, can you give us an idea of the scope of the technology transfer and this foreign investment as a strategy to basically steal technology from the U.S. Or American companies? Like, what is the scope of these activities? And it's kind of hard to grapple with the idea of, for example, China trying to learn to make something that Texas Instrument makes. And TI doesn't need, foreign investment, basically. TI has lots of money. And in that case, like, what can pretty much Chinese companies or the SOEs do to accomplish this plan?
Yeah, and I think this is a really interesting question. And unfortunately, I think, 5 months ago, we were talking a lot about Chinese investment and whether they were acquiring sensitive technologies. And because everything has just been going at such a fast pace, I think we've never really reached a consensus answer to that. There is a sense that China is acquiring valuable technologies abroad. And there's good examples of Chinese companies sort of gobbling up foreign companies and subsuming their technology. I mean, this is a stated strategy of the Chinese government. And if you look at recent guiding opinions from the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, or the CAC, you see like there is very much like we're promoting companies to go abroad and acquire advanced foreign technology. So there is very much a strategy. I think it's another question. Whether we should always, if they're always acquiring technology that they otherwise wouldn't acquire. So I think especially in things like AI, well, the Chinese are quite advanced at AI. So if we're stopping Chinese companies from investing in the U.S., are we actually gaining much? And I think a lot of the places where a lot of the things that the Chinese really want to acquire are things like semiconductor companies. It's stuff like Texas Instruments. And those targets are oftentimes already quite hard or almost out of reach. The Chinese can't easily acquire a U.S. semiconductor company, especially in this climate, and especially because that goes before CFIUS, which is the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which is a panel of a government panel that approves or rejects foreign investments or acquisitions of sensitive U.S. companies. So, yeah, I mean, I think the Chinese are going to have trouble sort of carrying out that strategy, especially since they've sort of been caught, so to speak. A few years ago, we weren't thinking that much about the effects of Chinese investments in these sectors. But I think a critical component to everything that we're seeing right now is going to be how does the EU and other large trade partners, where do they line up? Because of the way that Trump started this whole trade war by targeting steel and basically punching all of our allies in the face before going after China, where the Chinese see an opening to basically go to the EU or go to Germany or go to Japan and be like, listen, we know we have a lot of problems. We haven't had the best relationship, but here, like, we're going to give you these great deals, this great access to the Chinese market. We'll give you a preferential, treatment, and we can let bygones be bygones, and we'll just gang up against the United States. I think that's really what the Chinese are banking on, that they're going to be able to divide the coalition of countries that would otherwise, line up and demand that the Chinese change how they're practicing industrial development. So we're gonna. I think it's an open question, and I think at the moment everything is just a little too heated. And I think also to really see how, I think it's a little too heated to see how what's going to happen. But I think another component, another component is that a lot of the companies that Chinese are trying to acquire they're not companies that are doing particularly well. They're companies that have liquidity problems, that are suffering downturns, that are declaring bankruptcy. Major example is I believe it's pronounced Axitron, which is a German company, and basically the Chinese company that tried to acquire Axitron was blocked both by Germany and the United States, because Axitron does sensitive work with the U.S. government. Basically like that company was already sort of in a major hole, and since that the acquisition bid was rejected, the Chinese competitors have sort of filled that company's role. And there's I think two large state-owned companies which are basically doing exactly what Axitron was doing, was this sort of complicated process related to creating semiconductor chips. So yeah, I mean, I think a lot of these, there's a really, it's really quite complex, and the real implications of Chinese investments are going to be hard to actually sort of gauge for a while.
So, Lorand, I'm going to close with a moral philosophy question for you. So, as a patriotic American, considering working for one of these Chinese tech firms, where would you draw the line?
Oh man, that's a good question. I would love to get your 2 cents on this too. I think a lot of the reaction to Chinese tech right now is quite, for lack of a better term, is a little bit jingoistic. That we're seeing it's an us versus them type competition, and I think the reality is that there's a large Chinese tech companies like JD or like Baidu or like Alibaba, and these companies are they're international. They're listed on the NASDAQ. They have CSRs. These companies aren't interested in primarily being the foot soldiers of Xi Jinping's quest to become a cyber superpower. And I think I would encourage people to work for companies like that. I think it's good I don't want those companies to become sort of forced into taking a side in this sort of brewing science and tech war between the U.S. and China. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of companies which are, they're not interested in being they're interested in stakeholder returns, which is, a natural thing for a big company to be interested in. But I think we're going to start seeing more and more companies like Chinese sort of unicorns that are going to be basically fulfilling this specific mission of the Chinese government, partly because of the ongoing trade tensions. And I would, I think people are going to have to think twice whether they want to work for companies that are very much serving the state's interest in the world. So yeah, I mean, do you have an opinion on that, Jordan?
I think I'm pretty much in agreement with you. One of the tricky things is particularly with content companies. because that you get a lot closer to the censorship, a lot closer to the, these sorts of issues that we were talking about earlier with Bytedance. And I think the like level of complicity one may feel kind of goes up when you, when your app is something that you can't discuss sensitive topics on or whatnot. But I do think it's like a net positive for the world to have more people doing, instead of 3 companies trying to make self-driving cars, there are now 7 because all the big Chinese companies are working on this issue alongside Uber and Amazon and Google. And just having, more high tech stuff, more companies is like a net plus for global development. So I think on the whole, it's a good thing for the world that these companies exist, not a bad thing. And there are definitely, a lot of tensions and a lot of, big questions for American policymakers when it comes to stuff like Made in China 2025 and, potential censorship issues that would come with these content companies going abroad. But, on the whole, I think it is, I think it's not something that the U.S. per se should be scared of. The fact that China does have unicorns that are doing really interesting things and are creating innovations that I think can benefit not just Chinese, and not just people in the rest of the world, but even Americans as well. So, I hope that this trade war doesn't really kick off and doesn't necessarily and doesn't end up leading to an even bigger kind of segregation, digital segregation, which is something that the Chinese government is certainly complicit in, basically giving Google giving Google the boot and making it very difficult for Amazon to get going here. But on the whole, I think it just would be better for the world if we don't have this sort of like spheres of tech influence that the world is chopped up to, and instead have all these companies being able to compete in all different markets. So we'll see if Trump is successful in prying open any industries. We'll see to what extent the U.S. shuts off these sort of cross-border investments. But I think it's pretty clear. And there's a pretty strong consensus that an unending trade war doesn't really benefit anyone. So we'll be following this story closely on China Econ Talk, but it's it's serious stuff. And aside from the light tone that we've been talking about this, we've been using to talk about this issue, there are very, very big stakes going forward, and these economic tensions can certainly spill over to more serious security ones. So here's to hoping that doesn't end up being the case. And with that, I think we'll call it an episode. So Lorand, thanks so much for taking the time. Athena, you did a great job co-hosting. Maybe we'll have you on at some point.
Maybe.
And I don't know. Looking forward to having you back on the show soon, Lorand.
Great, thanks. Yeah, that was incredibly well said. So, I was happy to be on.
当你开始担心没法迈步，只好摆出无所谓的态度，金玉其外，败絮其中，真正的霸气不用外露，更不用谁来帮我带路，跟我路一直在脚下踩，只要我想要的都会有，倒是从来都不需要老爸买。All by myself， 跟你不同，心甘情愿的当个蛀虫，我想靠自己的双手赚，哪怕有段时间特别穷。你说没钱就没朋友，那种朋友跟钱走，他们只会跟你蹭红酒，一旦出事没人伸援手，我早看透。真的 homie 穷不走，不仅要把钱赚够，还要跟我的 homie 同富有。所以说爱我的恨我的赖我的蹭我的来几次都别停，在鱼龙混杂的社会里，有时候幽默的就像是卓别林。这个年代笑贫不笑娼，比较暴力比较黄，你只要房子不要窗，无神论者开教堂，你只想靠天靠地靠朋友，靠瞎猫碰上个死老鼠，真正牛逼的靠自己，别的都是纸老虎。都在玩套路，你不过就是挖个陷阱，小心的跳舞，我把我人生调成电影。别再玩套路，你把你自己玩进陷阱，愉快的跳舞，不小心就把人生调成电影。都在玩套路，你不过就是挖个陷阱，小心的跳舞，我把我人生调成电影。别再玩套 快的跳舞，不小心就把人生掉成泥。于是被套路过的人开始原样照搬，想要找寻靠山，全部都怕落单，也跟着玩起套路。但是就算你有了靠山，也没法靠关，人际关系还得靠伴，迷信靠玻尿酸，没人怕暴露，所以套路离我远一点，我比较危险，你的把戏会被拆穿，最多再给你个鬼脸。跟你相比，我是烂演员，除了想要赚点钱，坦白说我还想把腰杆挺直，再痛痛快快的玩几年。还记得那时候一无所有，常常靠借钱来过的生活，睡梦里问上帝还有多久，我才能够摆脱这样的生活，一直在思考要怎么行动，干脆让行动来帮我思考，先赚点零用，让自己吃饱。我发誓要让家人为我自豪，他们看不看得惯，笑也都懒得管，背后的 bullshit 都随你便。地球还得转太多，是等着办，只会看到更屌的教你借，所以别再胡说八道，在现实里没有人会为你拼。等我把我想要的都拿到，再来写首励志的歌给你听。别套路，你不过就是挖个陷阱，小心的跳舞，我把我人生跳成电影。别再玩套路，你把你自己玩进陷阱。愉快的跳舞，不小心就把人生跳成电影。都在玩套路，你不过就是挖个陷阱，小心的跳舞，我把我人生跳成电影。别再玩套路，你把你自己玩进陷阱。愉快的跳舞，不小心就把人生跳成电影。
They say being a parent is a full-time job, but I already have one of those. Luckily, I use Instacart to help me order everything I need while I'm stuck in meetings all day. So while Instacart is helping me get groceries, snacks for school lunches, and something for at-home happy hour, I get more time back to juggle my day job and my mom job. Save time by downloading the Instacart app or visit instacart.com to get $10 off your first order using the code INGREDIENTS10. Offer valid for a limited time. Minimum order $35. Delivery subject to availability. Additional terms apply.